have to be,
Or lights them?
but that's your gig though, right?
Kind of,
That's
yes.
kinda how it
Yeah.
happened.
The one
Yes,
in
in
Cabo?
Cabo.
I had a
Yeah.
baby on the way with
Cool. Oh,
someone, and
so I
I
will
was
be
trying to
going to
get to know her
Arizona.
family, so that's how I started going to church, to like spend time with her family.
I think
That's how
I
I
think I'm
started
gonna be
going.
going the ninth.
April?
Do you need help with anything?
I think that's it. I think that's all set up. I don't think there's anything else needed for now, unless you don't want to play the piano.
I don't know.
I just took off.
Okay.
I'd be fine.
How's work?
It's going.
I'm doing good.
I worked in the office today, but well, for the first half of the day I worked at the office, and then I went home on my lunch break and stayed at home. And then tomorrow I can work from home the whole day.
Oh, nice.
Like, this job makes my brain hurt when the day's over. My brain is fried from trying to understand it.
So what part of health service you? What part of health service?
Department of Social Services.
Oh, social service.
Yeah.
You're a social service.
Yeah, I work in the Children and Family Services
Oh, okay.
division. Where we oversee like foster care and adoptions.
Yeah. Ugh. And I worked there, the Health and Welfare Agency, was it Child Protective Services? Which is now Franchise Tax Board, right? I think, so that,
I'll probably ask her.
that was.
No, I thought like this.
I
thought like last week.
Franchise Tax Board, because they're after deadbeat dads, I guess.
Yeah. I bought an apple.
Did you?
What building you work?
It's 744 feet.
It's way cheaper than what no.
It's the two towers that are the same size and everything. Same block.
When I was there, one of those was health services, one was social services, primarily. But
Yeah.
I worked a little while at, with the Legion building.
And I also had
That's right.
Kind of across the street.
Across the street. My mom worked there too during the same time that I was working for social services, so sometimes we would get lunch together because we're right across the
I think
street.
it's like 260.
Now they're remodeling that whole
Maybe.
Basin building.
I only have a 9.
That Beijing building's been nothing but problems since they opened it.
So technically,
Trying to make it all this
I'm only technically paying
environmentally
Yeah.
sound. We had
I guess it's getting a.
we had people getting sick all the time from the beginning, from the day we opened the building.
You're saying technically saving.
My office used to be in, you know, OB1 is, right across from the Capitol, OB1, the two buildings, the circle, the one office building, and the court.
I did not be here every morning. I just started when I came back.
Yeah.
I don't think I was in that building but a couple of months. Good change, but yeah. People were getting sick from mold, fungus. Oh my God.
Was it already in the building when it started?
It was brand new, and they built it, it was kind of a, it was supposed to be this environmentally sensitive building, and
We're almost starting. Let me know, Ellie, when we're starting up. Didn't even interrupt. We on? Good evening, guys. Good evening from River City Baptist Church. If you're expecting a handsome young man, pastor's not here today, so it's just me. But yeah, so he actually texted me a couple over announcements. So we'll start with that. We'll do some prayer, and then we'll jump into the Bible study today. So pastor texted me announcement number 1. We have a teen activity coming up on Saturday at 1 p.m. It's going to be tracks and axe. We're planning out on passing out tracks with the teens and then going to axe throwing venue for them. So excited for the teens doing that there. That sounds really fun. And then his additional announcement was for Resurrection Sunday. We're going to have 2 services, one at 9:30 and one at 11 a.m. So if you're planning on bringing somebody, there is 2 services. So if they say that they can't necessarily come into an earlier one or later one, just let them know that there are 2 services available. So we want to do our best to pack those out. This is an opportunity. Most people, tend to go to churches around this time. So this is a good opportunity if you have any friends or family who don't necessarily go, that you can bring them and you'll hear a good gospel message with Pastor there. And then any prayer requests. I'll take some prayer requests from, yes, sir, Brother Phil. Yes, sir.
So just a reminder that next Thursday night, we're going to see the documentary, The Flood, at the theater. So if anybody wants to go, I need to know, because we're
See Brother Phil.
buying tickets. Nobody else would pay until we go.
What time on Thursday, Brother Phil?
7 o'clock at the theaters over in Truxell.
Next Thursday, right?
The Regal Theater.
Next Thursday, correct?
Thursday, yeah, the
21st Thursday, just to reiterate what Brother Phil saying, they're going to go see The Flood at a theater there. So if you want any additional information, they're trying to buy group tickets, so try to contact him as soon as possible.
Pastor sent out an email with my number on it.
Perfect. Pastor should have sent out an email, so just look for the information there.
I think I have about 8 people signed up.
That's a pretty good sized group. If I wasn't working, I would wish I would go. But yeah, so see Brother Phil.
I've seen the documentary already. I saw the premiere of it, so
So you had the early viewing for it.
it's good. It's really good. I think they drug it out a little too much.
Brother Phil, the movie buff over here, is giving his rating. So he says it's 5 out of 5 stars so far. So 4.5 out of 5 stars. So he said he highly recommended. So bring your popcorn, email Brother Phil, and he'll get some tickets going so that you guys can go there. 8 people so far signed up for that. So if we can get that a little more, that'd be great. Any prayer requests now that announcements are done? Yes, sir.
Request for your grandpa.
For our grandpa, yes, sir. Our Grandpa Soto is in the hospital currently right now, so if you would just pray for them. Don't necessarily have any updates or any news so far, but I know that that's something that's weighing down them. So if you just pray for them, currently that's ongoing. Any other prayer requests? Pray for me as I'm up here. I'm going to be hopefully speaking, just that I would do well here. Prayer request for me. Also, prayer request answered was that Abby and Becca both came back safely from the respective, very hot, very nice warm weather that they were in. One from Cabo, I believe. Was it Cabo? And then one from Colombia. Yep. And then did Abby leave this morning? I didn't even know Abby was leaving. So Abby left this morning, and then Becca's leaving in 2 days now again. So they're both flying again. So if we would just, same exact prayer request, safety for both going there and coming back. Any other prayer requests? If not, we'll go and bow our heads. All right. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for just allowing this group of people to come and to worship you, Lord, and just to come to you in prayer and just to hear your message. I pray that you would just be with their prayer requests today, just with Grandpa Soto, just as he's in the hospital there, Lord. I pray that you would just be with that situation and the Soto family. I pray that you would just keep Abby and Becca safe. They're both going to be traveling soon again. And then I pray that you'll just be with me, Lord, just to take myself out of this message and just to hear you speak through me, Lord. Just make sure that I'm humble and that I can hear specifically what you would have me draw out of this passage, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're going to go ahead and turn to Exodus 1. Exodus 1, we're going to be in verse 6. I know Pastor did Genesis a little while ago, but I actually had something pop up recently as I was listening and watching, and so I really wanted to go back to Moses' story. So that's where we're going to be specifically. So we're going to be talking about the birth of Moses. I'll give you guys a little bit of time as we get into Exodus 1, verse 6, and we're going to go through 16 here. I'll read that. Exodus 1, verse 6 through 16. So, and Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, and he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, and let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service where they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Siphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew woman, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. So this is kind of just a backstory, just a setup to Moses' birth as he's coming in. And so just a couple of things, if you're taking notes or if you're kind of jotting down in your memory, just a couple of points that I want to show through this initial passages. The first one is that Joseph's death and his generations end. So we see here up in verse 6, and Joseph died and all his brethren and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. So we see in this start of this passage that Joseph has died. A lot of his children has died, and most of the generation of Joseph's time has passed on. And we also see down here in verse 7 is that there is a huge increase of population. The children of Israel are known for many things, and one of them is like, you're going to be numbered as many as the sands of the stars of the sky. They keep growing. They keep growing as a people. There's no necessarily stopping the amount of growth that these people have. Even as we kind of continue on in this passage and Pharaoh tries to kind of cut them off at the feet, we see that that doesn't necessarily stop their growth. So we see the increase of population and Joseph's death and his generation.
So,
Yes, sir.
so it's always important to me to realize that verse 7,
Mm-hmm.
6 and 7, we're talking about 300 years
Yeah.
past.
Yeah. So yeah, like generations are not necessarily like.
It's because it's a whole bunch.
Yep. So it's not necessarily just like a 1-2 year passage. Generations are basically the lifespan of those people that knew and lived at the time of Joseph, knew the story. As you can kind of see further on, like, the king of that time forgot, basically don't have any knowledge of it. Like, it's not necessarily common knowledge that Joseph was the hero of Egypt. The generations of his time has already passed. So there's a large, like, you are correct in saying there's a large amount of time in this time. Generations just mean like the whole lifespan of when he was living there. So the second thing we see is the new leadership of Egypt. And so if you can go down to verse 8, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, just like Brother Phil was saying. This king had no knowledge of Joseph, whether he was a bad student in history or if he just was not necessarily alive or just didn't necessarily want to study up on Joseph. Joseph was a hero of Egypt when Joseph came in, saved the Egyptians from starvation. But this king did not know who he was. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. And so we see that the fear of the people of Israel is starting to stir in him, and he's fearful of something specific happening. In verse 10, we say, Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and they fight against us, and so get them out of the land. So the multiplication and the largeness of the scale was something that he was fearful, but the main reason why he was fearful was on the happen chance of either revolting or joining against them in a war. Even though there wasn't necessarily anything to, kind of stir up that currently, it was just more of this huge fear of him of like, these people are not my people necessarily. If there is any war that happens, who's to say which side they choose? Like I said, with how much Joseph gave to Egypt and how much Joseph's family, Joseph's children, Joseph's wives were all Egyptian, half Egyptian. So there had some blood ties in there, but that king necessarily was, these people are not necessarily mine. I don't necessarily know which side they're going to choose if something happens. Exactly. Many, many, many of them. So the third thing we see here that the new king does is as you jump down, he says, therefore they did set over them tasks masters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So we see the thing that his solution for this was the amount of growth, the amount of fear that he had was basically, we're going to turn them into slaves. So these Israels were one day living as, people that were working in the city, had jobs, certain things like that, almost kind of like what the Jews were dealing with in terms of times of Germany. It's like they had jobs, they were living as normal people in those cities, and all of a sudden, with a wave of a hand, a new leadership comes in, and these people instantly turn into slaves. They're hunted down. They're basically being rounded up and given specific jobs of building up the new Egypt that he wanted to see. So that's the second thing we see. First thing we saw was Joseph's death and his generation. Second one, we see the new leadership of Egypt. And the third thing that we're going to see is the affliction and growth. So as we jump down into verse 11 again, therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, look at verse 12, the more they multiplied and grew. And we saw at the first start of the verse that the growth and the multiplication were already happening. And we see even after his so-called solution, the growth and multiplication were still happening. Back to verse 12. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel, and the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. So we see here, the more the affliction, the more they grew. They added even more labor on top of this to retaliate against the growth, but Pharaoh also had another solution to kind of come up with that as well. As you look down to verse 14, and they made the lives more bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and all manner of service in the field. So they added more tasks on top of that. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Sifra, and the name of the other Pua. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew woman, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if he be a daughter, then she shall live. So first solution was like, hey, we're going to put them in bondage. We're going to put them in slavery. We're basically going to break their will, break their spirit. We're going to use them to build up Egypt, to make it more strong, to make it more of a stronghold, to build up treasure cities, to make it more beautiful. And then when that wasn't working necessarily in the amount of growth that he was seeing in Israel, his fear even stirred up more to the point where I want to kill all the baby boys, basically. If there's a son, I want to wipe them out, which is, if you think from a logical leadership standpoint, that is very, if you follow his kind of track, you understand kind of why he made that decision. The men are the soldiers. The men are necessarily the ones who can kind of revolt. They have their specific places. They have their specific jobs that they usually hold. So he's saying, I'm going to kill kind of a generation, and that in turn will end up stopping at least the growth or the multiplication somewhat. And so we see Pharaoh carrying out this basically his new command, his new law towards these specific midwives to stop the growth of Israel at this point. And this is more of the backstory to kind of see where Moses enters into this story. And we're going to turn into Exodus 2, just a page over. So just to kind of point out again, this is the world that Moses will soon enter in, and he was made for just a time like this, and we'll see that the Lord kind of had all this set up. So first main point is God's reason. Exodus 2, we're going to start in verse 1. Exodus 2 and verse 1, just a little bit over here. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to a wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when he saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and dabbed it with slime, with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river brink. So we see that all of this basically, we would agree that at this moment, at this time, it's probably not necessarily the greatest or the smartest decision from our outside perspective to have a kid at this moment. And we see specifically from this man and this wife, they're both from the Levi family, the Levi tribe, that they already have 2 kids. We know from the story of Moses and his lineage, he has a brother and a sister already. So it's not like this man and woman are needing necessarily, this is not their first child. It's not like necessarily they're new to marriage and want to start a family. They already have kids. They already have 2, basically like a brother and a daughter, the siblings. And so it's not necessarily that they need this other son. And so we see the highly likelihood that this, as soon as your son is born, and she understood this because she hid him for 3 months, that you would see him carried away to be slaughtered under this new command, under this new rule by Pharaoh. And this would make a lot of the population, from just kind of, if you think through it, that a lot of population would probably not want to have kids anymore at this point, or even try with the chance of a 50-50 chance of even having a son. But we're going to see, but Moses' parents thought different. This is going to be the second point. So all of us would agree that this is a horrible time to have a kid. The second point is that Moses' parent thought different than us. If we turn to Hebrews 11:23, Hebrews 11:23. If you want to take a second to find that there. Hebrews 11:23. Wait for a second for people to get that there. Hebrews 11:23. This is the hall of faith, as you would say, the chapter that kind of talks about, and faith, by faith, this person did this and this person accomplished this. And we're going to see in verse 23, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. So we see here the faith of Moses' parents. You can turn back to Exodus. I just wanted to point that out, that even his parents were talked about later on in the hall of faith. Even though they have like a little snippet in there, just the fact that it says both parents, it mentions them that they had enough faith to disobey the king's commandment at that time, and they had faith to have Moses, which, looking through the whole backstory of what's happening, would take a tremendous amount of faith. Like I said, that's kind of almost going back to the Nazi Jewish kind of thing. That would basically be saying, like, if Jewish parents had kids during that time, that's the same amount of struggle and amount of hardship that they would be enduring during that time. It's basically almost like instantly killing your kid. Most people would think that. So we see Moses' parents understood the circumstances that were surrounding them, but they still had faith. Remember, like I said, they already had 2 kids at this point, so it wasn't necessarily needed that they need these kids. Basically, their children were going to be automatic slaves as soon as they were born. They had no other profession at that time. But they wanted to obey God and had faith that he would take care of the rest. Moses' first example of growing up with just the faith of his parents. Turn to Jeremiah 1. Jeremiah 1. We're going to be turning some chapters in here. Jeremiah 1 and verse 4, starting in verse 4. Jeremiah 1, chapter 1, verse 4. All right. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 4. And going down to verse 10. Then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Then said I, the Lord God, Behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child. But the Lord said unto me, Say not, I am a child, for thou shalt go to all I shall send thee, and whatsoever I commanded thee shalt thou speak. Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord. Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said unto me, Behold, I have put my words in my mouth. See, I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down and to build and to plant. So this is not necessarily specifically talking about Moses. The one thing I want to pull out of this is verse 5, where it says, Before I formed thee in the belly, and I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. This is one of the main verses we use to go against abortion, in terms of God knows us even before, scientifically, before doctors know that we're necessarily there in our mothers, that, God has a specific purpose. He knows us. He has an intimate knowledge of who we are. He has the purposes and reasons and what we're going to do later on in our life, even before we're even a thought. But the thing that I like about this verse as well, this is something specifically in Jeremiah, but the other things I like is kind of like a correlation of kind of what happened in Moses' life as well, is that Moses didn't necessarily like to speak in front of people. And in this passage, it says that the Lord will be his words and the Lord will speak through him and use him as a mouth. And I think it's just kind of great that even throughout the Bible, there are other people and other prophets and other major leaders that had all these issues, but the Lord still used them. But the one thing I wanted to pull out with is this, that the Lord had a purpose. The Lord had a purpose in Moses being born at that time. The Lord knew who he was. The Lord had knowledge of who he was going to be becoming. And so, like I said, the first thing that we were going to talk about was God's reason, and we can see God's reason is even before knowledge of that what we have. Then we're going to go into God's work. So turn back to, we're going to turn to Psalm. We're going to turn to another verse that I like to talk to people about when we're talking about prior knowledge to being born. We're going to Psalm 139, Psalm 139. Just a little snippet as well. I'll read this. You don't necessarily have to go there. Psalm 139, verse 13 through 14, and then jump down to 17. Psalm 139. For thou hast possessed my reins. Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. And then jump down to 17. How precious also are the thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. And I think this shows a little bit more of a personal touch in terms of God having thoughts towards me. And it's talking about in terms of my mother's womb and how fearfully and wonderfully made I am, even before there's knowledge of who we are, who I am to earth standards. So just kind of pointing those out, that in today's world, logically, we would think Moses shouldn't have been there. Probably Moses shouldn't have had that chance to be born. Moses, would say like, hey, like according to today's standards, we probably would have gotten rid of Moses. But God had a specific reason and a purpose for Moses, and these verses are a pointer and the truth towards that. We have a specific purpose that God has given us as well. These verses aren't necessarily just tied to Moses or to David or to Jeremiah. These all are across our life as well. The Lord knows us intimately. The Lord knows our purpose, and the Lord knew us before we even were formed in our mother's womb. Now jumping into God's work, the second main point, God's work. Going back to Exodus 2, verses 4 through 9. I'll read the beginning of the second one as well there. And there went a man of the house of Levi and took to a wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein and laid it in the flags by the river banks. Verse 4. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said it to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I shall give thee wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And so here we can kind of see God's working in the beginning stages of Moses' life. He is about 3 months old, maybe a little bit older than that, as his mother, puts him down into the river. And at this point, I can kind of maybe you can kind of read into a little bit that the mother is trusting the Lord to kind of do his work in with that. But at the same time, I don't necessarily know if she has a thought of ever seeing this son again. I don't think logically there's a thought that would come in her minds like, maybe he'll return to me one day. I think at this point, for his safety, for his sake, she's basically kind of trying to save him, thinking that maybe something would happen, maybe somebody would pick him up, maybe the death through the river is better than necessarily just giving him to the soldiers and either killing him or giving him to a crocodile. At least there's some sort of safety net or a little bit better circumstances during that route. So I think that beginning this, the mother's kind of given up all hope of ever seeing her son at this point. But we see God's working. So the first point, God didn't make Moses with a purpose and then just leave him to fend by himself. The same thing with us. God doesn't necessarily give us a purpose in our life and then just say, all right, perfect, you're on earth and now you're done. I'm not going to help you throughout any of the process anymore. God works through our lives in us and around us, and we can kind of see this in this story. The second one, we see from this passage that God's hand was guiding things in those that were surrounding Moses. And the third one, from Moses' perspective, you have to watch and hope that your baby would survive. That in itself would be a miracle. But not only she was given a motherly role for the child, she was paid as well to help and raise her son. And in those kind of type of circumstances, we would already automatically just say, like, the fact that the baby survived going down the river was already a miracle. Nobody would be like, all right, statistically possible. That's crazy. But not on top of that, we see the Lord doesn't necessarily just do happen chances and circumstances, and all this is randomly by chance. Moses' sister happens to watch as it goes down the river, follows it. Pharaoh's daughter picks it up. And not only does she say, this is a Hebrew child, and then just give it to a soldier, she decides to keep the child. And then on top of that, the sister bumps in and says, hey, would you like somebody to take care of this child? And it happens all to where the mother receives the child back, has a motherly role in the child's life to where she gets to raise him at least until he's done having milk from her, and then hands her back to the Pharaoh's daughter at that point. And so I just think that's a huge miracle, although it kind of summarizes that in between 3 to 4 verses, the amount of craziness and the amount of like working in God's hand that needs to be going through that is just miraculous, to say the least. Is that God doesn't necessarily have Moses being born and then just throw him out into nothingness and just say, fend for yourself. We don't know what's going to happen. The Lord steers that entire process so that not only his mother has a chance to be with him, but also that he has the ability to be raised in one of the, I would say, the safest environments at that point. So we see God's work in that. I would say, just kind of as a personal story, you probably could do this exercise as well as if you're at home or you're here. We probably don't necessarily have a crazy story of being thrown almost into crocodiles or being raised by Pharaoh or anything like that. But we could all probably look into our own lives and kind of track that trail of where God's hand is leading. And I kind of did that before I kind of came into here. I was just not starting all the way back into my grandpa and great grandpa, but even just from my dad. I could say, like, my dad grew up and he wanted to become a missionary. He became a missionary, went to Mexico, then went to Peru. My mom lived in Peru. She was a Catholic, so she would have technically never met my dad if she stayed a Catholic. God led her to become a Christian with her family, and she became a Christian school teacher / helper. My dad met her at this Christian school. They moved to Seattle, and then they met, had me, had my sisters, had my little brother. My sister goes off to a college, meets Abby Soto. I go off to a college. I actually leave college, and it wouldn't have happened to where we graduated at the same time if I didn't leave at that specific point. Since I left college, I didn't have any money. When I went back, I had to work at Chick-fil-A, and that will come back later. So I worked for Chick-fil-A. I go back to college, and Beck and I start talking around this time. After we graduate, I moved to Sacramento, and guess what? All our plans go out the window, and COVID happens. So because of COVID, because I have no money, I have to go back to the job that I already knew, which was Chick-fil-A. At Chick-fil-A, I work there, and I meet a guy named Adonis. And Adonis, I bring him to church, and Adonis becomes saved shortly thereafter. And this is not necessarily like, to prop up Adonis or anything like that. If he was watching, he knows I told this story like countless times. But just all that to show that, like, nothing to necessarily do with me doing something great. But if none of that happened, and you could probably branch that out into so many other people and so many other places and so many other people coming to the Lord, even, my salvation testimony, my sister's salvation testimony, but just all that to kind of happen just so that one person could come to church and be saved is pretty miraculous to kind of just track that all through the life. And this is only within the span of maybe about 10 verses, and we're talking about 3 to 4 months of time between Moses' life where there's a lot of miraculous things are happening to where not all of that could just have been explained by, oh, well, they were there at the right time at the right place. Like, all these things is God's hand is stirring and moving through all these people's lives, everything through Moses and surrounding Moses to where Moses can kind of be propped up for later. So that is something that you can do at home. I think it was just kind of like eye-opening to me just to know that, like, sometimes we live day to day and we kind of forget that God is working around us. We kind of lose sight. We kind of focus just on kind of what we're doing, whether that's the job and then the bills and then going back home and then wake up and repeat, to where we lose sight of everything that God has been doing all the way from the past up until now to kind of lead us to where we are. The next main point is God's preparation. God's preparation. This is my last and final point. Let's go and jump back to Exodus 2, and then we're going to go ahead and start back in verse 4. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it, and the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And this final point is God's preparation. So just in verse 10, I don't necessarily know if you've seen the movie like The Prince of Egypt. I actually recently just kind of like, that's kind of what drew this message. Was I recently I didn't watch it, but I just kind of came in contact again. I remember watching that as a child and was like, this is a great cartoon. If you haven't watched it, they do take some liberties in some things. It's not necessarily super accurate, but like, we've only read over 15 verses and they had to turn a whole movie from 15 verses. So kind of they had to take some creative liberty. But I do think it does stay true to some of the story and kind of like the upbringing of Moses. And in this specific verse, we see God's preparation just in him being raised in Egypt in Pharaoh's house. We know that he probably received, I think it's later on in Acts, we talks about Moses' training and Moses' schooling, the fact that he learned, at least we know of 2 languages, whether that's the Hebrew language and the Egypt language. Most of the slaves probably knew that at the same time as well, being in contact with Egypt for such a time as listening to the slave drivers and then also living there from the time of Joseph. But we at least know he knew 2 languages. He probably was taught how to fight. He was probably taught history, at least somewhat, of either Egypt. He probably not taught as much of the Hebrew history at that point when he was growing up. But we know that his scholarship, we know that he was at least given the best of the best, at least in the time of being raised up in Pharaoh. Within such royalty, you had to have at least some knowledge and see some things that most other people don't get to see. So we see that kind of preparation that which would later on kind of be used in everything else. So we see that Moses later would use this as he became a leader for the Israelites. He became a writer. He wrote, at least we think of the 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books. He wrote the laws, which were given him by God. He was in many battles and wars, and so he had to be somewhat of a leader, a tactician. And he was a scholar as well, as he had to kind of write down everything of it in terms of the history that was happening at that time. And all that to say, I don't think necessarily, yes, God played a part in that, but there was some things that he probably brought from his upbringing that made that a little bit lighter of a load later on. And so all of this helped him accomplish what God had for his life. And so just to kind of draw at least something for us for a personal conclusion, this is talking about Moses and the great and grand thing that happened to him as he was just born and kind of raising up. But like I said, through that personal little thing that I did for my life, we can probably look into us as well and say the Lord had a hand in my birth, in my raising up, and then also from my raising up, from my parents' teachings, from what I've gone through either college or my young adult life. Like God is using those things now, even as I grow older. Even maybe if I'm not out as much, maybe I don't have in contact as much of the people when I grew up, but I can still use those things that the Lord laid upon me and my parents laid upon me earlier on. All that to kind of draw the conclusion, if we want to go to Hebrews 11, back to Hebrews 11, just one more time. I feel like this summarizes perfectly what Moses has kind of done and had accomplished and the Lord let him do. Hebrews 11, verse 24 through 29. Hebrews 11, 24 through 29. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, saying to, were drowned. And I like how they added the Red Sea as kind of like the thing at the very end. Like that wasn't necessarily so important until the very end. Like everything else that they gave importance to was all the things that happened later on. The Red Sea to our eyes would be that's probably the thing we think of first, is the Red Sea and like the 10 Commandments. Those are the main points we like hear in Moses' story. But that to hear in the Hall of Faith wasn't necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing was him denying Egypt, kind of going the route that the Lord wanted him to, remembering the Passover, forsaking Egypt. All those things were more important to God than necessarily the great grand gestures that happened later on. And I think in our lives, if we kind of take the examples of what happened in Moses' upbringing and in his birth and later on in his life, I feel like we can see the hand of God playing just as much as part as in Moses' life as in our life. So as we bow our heads, just remember that the Lord is he's an intimate, he knows us. I feel like that we can use that knowledge and allow him to work with us as we grow older here. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you so much for this night. I pray that came through clearly and that people got certain points out of it or something that could help them later on, Lord. I know that through kind of refinding that movie, Lord, that it kind of stirred up my heart, Lord, about specifically about praying to you, Lord, about the people that the Hebrews at that time were crying out to you, Lord. I know that in my life, like there's some certain things that I need to ask for help with you, Lord, on. Specifically in Moses' life, I know I can thank you for having such a hand in a guiding force through my parents, through my life, and a lot of the talents and the things I've learned as a younger person that I've now been able to use later on in my life, whether that's through bringing people into church or helping them find you, Lord, or just knowing the saving grace of you, Lord. I pray that you would just allow us to take what was said tonight and just apply it to our lives, however you would see fit. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys, so we have 10 minutes left. There's no piano.